The wind cut through the empty plains like a restless spirit, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and dust. In the distance, the sun hovered low, burning the horizon gold and red, casting long shadows across the abandoned cabin that stood like a forgotten memory. The Apache, a tall figure with eyes sharp as flint and a presence that demanded attention, rode slowly toward it. His name was Dakota, meaning friend to all, though the world had given him little to trust. He had come not for hope, but for an end, a quiet place to disappear from the life that had beaten him into silence. The cabin was a skeleton of its former self, boards creaking under the gentle push of the wind, windows staring like hollow eyes. Stories of those who had once lived there lingered in the air, whispered in the rustling leaves and the groan of timber. Dakota dismounted, the leather of his boots sinking into the soft earth, and ran a hand along the rough wood. For a man who had faced the unforgiving desert, the lonely mountains, and battles that scarred both body and soul, this place seemed fitting. It was desolate, forgotten, and perfect for someone who wanted to vanish from the world. But the moment he stepped inside, the air felt different, heavy with a history he could not name. The cabin smelled of smoke, long gone cold, and of earth that had soaked in life and sorrow. Sunlight filtered through the cracks, painting golden lines across the floor where dust danced in the quiet. Dakota's gaze swept the room, lingering on a small hearth, an old rocking chair, and a shelf lined with books whose pages were curled with age. He paused at a window, watching the wildflowers sway in the breeze outside. It struck him that life could grow, even in places left behind, even in the heart of abandonment. He had brought only a few belongings with him, enough for survival and nothing more. His horse Kiona nickered softly at the door, sensing the unease in his rider. Dakota knelt to untie the saddlebag, his hands steady, though his mind churned with memories of a life that had been unkind. Battles, betrayals, and a love lost to Soonthese had driven him to seek a final refuge. Yet as he unpacked his simple tools and rations, a strange sensation began to take root, like a whisper brushing against his heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, the cabin was not the tomb he had imagined. Outside, the horizon shifted. The wind carried the distant sound of a creek, and the mountains loomed like silent guardians. Dakota felt a pull, an unspoken invitation to explore this small world he had chosen for oblivion. He stepped back onto the porch, the rough wood pressing into his calloused hands, and surveyed the land. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet pulse of life that refused to be extinguished. The birds flitted through the trees, a coyote howled far in the valley, and the sun dipped lower, setting the sky aflame with colors he had almost forgotten existed. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar emotion. It was neither grief nor despair. It was curiosity. That evening, as the sky deepened to purple and the first stars appeared, Dakota built a small fire in the hearth. The flames crackled, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost human, flickering across the walls of the cabin. He could feel the weight of solitude pressing against him, yet the warmth from the fire reminded him that there could be comfort even in isolation. He thought of the stories the cabin must hold, of the people who had lived and laughed here, and for the first time in years, he allowed a small hope to surface. Maybe survival was not just about enduring pain. Maybe it was about finding moments worth remembering. Night fell fully, and the quiet became deeper, almost sacred. Dakota lay on the rough cot, listening to the wind that whispered through the cracks. Dreams had long abandoned him, replaced by memories that were sharp and cold. Yet sleep came slowly, and when it did, it carried a vision of someone standing at the edge of the Metawal woman, with hair like copper, eyes fierce and gentle all at once. She was moving through the tall grass, tending to wildflowers, unaware of the lone man watching. Dakota awoke with a start, the memory lingering like a soft ache in his chest. He knew nothing of her, yet some invisible thread had already tied them together, a fate he could not yet see but could feel with every fiber of his being. Days passed, and Dakota began to restore the cabin slowly, patching boards, cleaning the hearth, and planting small patches of vegetables along the porch. Each task, simple and mundane, became a meditation, a small rebellion against the despair he had carried. He noticed the wildlife returning, timid at first, then bolder with each passing day. Birds nested near the rafters, rabbits darted across the meadow, and once he found a stray fox curled near the woods, Life, stubborn and relentless, was reclaiming the cabin, and it seemed to reclaim a part of him as well. One morning, as sunlight poured over the horizon, Tokoda spotted her again. The woman Liwa, a name he learned only when she spoke softly, a song carried by the wind, was tending to a small garden near the creek. She moved with quiet grace, her hands skilled and patient. Tokoda watched from the edge of the forest, his heart unsteady, a mix of longing and caution. He had come to this place seeking an end, yet here, in this moment, he felt the stirrings of something he had thought lost forever: connection, purpose, the possibility of love. He did not know how to approach her, nor did he want to frighten her. Instead, he returned to the cabin, heart pounding, the warmth of anticipation mingling with fear. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, the walls themselves echoing the promise of a future he had not dared imagine. Tokoda realized that life had a way of finding him, even when he had tried to escape it. And as the sun dipped once more behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, he understood that the abandoned cabin was no longer a place of endings. It was a place of beginnings. Yet the shadow of the past lingered. Tokoda knew that darkness had not entirely left him, and the world beyond the meadow was still fraught with dangers he could not control. There was a story here waiting to unfold, one of love, loss, and redemption. And as the wind whispered through the cabin walls, carrying the scent of pine and earth, Tokoda stood on the threshold of a life he had never expected to live, wondering what tomorrow might bring and whether he was ready for it. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles as Tokoda stepped outside. Kiona stamped her hooves, eager for movement, while the first rays of sunlight gilded the meadow. Tokoda's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of Liwa, but she was nowhere to be seen. Yet he could feel her presence, a subtle shift in the breeze, as if the wind itself whispered her name. His chest tightened with a strange mixture of hope and unease. He had no idea who she was, where she had come from, or what secrets she carried, but something in her quiet strength pulled at him, deeper than memory, deeper than reason. Tokoda's days began to fall into a rhythm. He tended to the cabin, mending broken boards, sweeping floors thick with dust, and keeping the hearth alive with firewood he chopped from nearby trees. Each act of care for the abandoned place mirrored the care he had never allowed himself to give anyone, or even himself. The solitude was still heavy, but it no longer suffocated him. The land itself seemed to respond to his presence. The creek sparkled clearer, deer appeared more frequently at dawn, and the songbirds returned to claim the branches as if the world approved of his decision to stay. Liwa became a figure on the edge of his life, appearing with the morning mist, tending the wildflowers near the creek, or collecting herbs in the shadow of the woods. She was careful not to approach the cabin, but neither did she retreat entirely from the paths Tokoda walked. Her movements were quiet, measured, and graceful, yet there was a fire in her gaze that warned he could not read her as easily as the wind or the land. Every time he caught sight of her, his heart raced, though he tried to quell it. He had come to the cabin seeking an end, but she was slowly teaching him that life had other plans. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Tokoda discovered a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Its pages were worn, ink faded, but the words were legible. They spoke of the cabin's previous owner, a man named Calvert, a loner who had once dreamed of raising a family and living free from the prying eyes of the town nearby. The journal told of laughter, love, and heartbreak, but also of fear. Calvert wrote of strange sightings in the forest, whispers at night, and shadows moving where no light should fall. Tokoda read by the flickering light of the hearth, feeling a chill creep along his spine. The past was alive here, layered like the rings of a tree, waiting for him to understand its secrets. The next morning, Tokoda rode along the ridge above the creek, scanning the horizon. A storm was brewing, clouds dark and heavy, and the wind carried the smell of rain. He spotted Liwa again, her copper hair catching the first glint of sun, kneeling by a small plot of wildflowers. She was singing softly, a tune that seemed almost like a prayer, and the sound tugged at something deep within him. He wanted to approach, to speak, to know, but a whisper of caution stopped him. There was danger here. He could feel it as clearly as he felt the stir of his own heartbeat. Tokoda's mind often wandered to the life he had left behind. Memories of battles fought and friends lost, of betrayal and grief, lingered like old scars. He remembered the time he had tried to save a village from a band of outlaws, only to arrive too late, and the ache of helplessness that had driven him west. He remembered love lost to fear and circumstance. A woman whose eyes were fierce like Liwa's, but whose heart had belonged elsewhere. And yet in this abandoned cabin, in the quiet of the woods, he began to sense that some wounds could heal if tended with patience and care. One late afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound that did not belong to the forest. A horse whinnied in the distance, and Takeda's instincts snapped to attention. Mounted Kiona and rode toward the sound, heart pounding. Luia was at the edge of the clearing, standing still, as if frozen by something unseen. Takota slowed as he approached, the weight of the journal in his saddlebag heavy against his side. The air between them seemed charged with tension. Her eyes, wide and alert, met his, and in them he saw not fear alone, but a question on, unspoken warning that the world outside the meadow was closer than they had imagined. The hours stretched long as they returned to the cabin, each step measured, careful. The storm rolled closer, thunder muttering in the distance, and the sky darkened with a bruised purple. Inside, Tokuda tended the fire, while Liwea prepared a simple meal. The two moved around each other with a quiet familiarity, the silence between them full of unspoken words. For the first time in years, Takota felt the pulse of life not as a burden, but as an invitation. Yet there was still something lingering, a shadow at the edges of the warmth, a mystery he could not name. Night fell, and the storm broke. Rain hammered the roof, the wind rattled the windows, and the creek swelled with water. Takota stood at the cabin door, watching the storm lash the land, and thought of the words in Calvert's journal. Whispers in the woods, shadows moving with purpose, signs left behind by those who had come before. He had come seeking an end, but the storm reminded him that life was unpredictable, wild and often dangerous, and Liwa quiet, resilient, yet fierce was at the heart of that unpredictability, a presence that pulled him forward, even as fear held him back. As the fire dwindled to embers, Tokuda noticed a figure moving just beyond the tree line. Minor, perhaps a shadow wearing the shape of a man, watched them. The recognition in his chest was instant. This was not a wanderer, not a lost traveler. Something from the past had found them, drawn by the same pulse that had stirred life back into the cabin. Liwea stirred beside him, sensing the change in the air, her eyes narrowing toward the movement. Tokuda felt a protective heat rise within him, a promise he did not yet know how to fulfill. The night stretched, heavy and electric, filled with the patter of rain and the rhythm of the wind. Kiona shifted nervously, sensing the tension in the forest, while Takota stood by the door, a silent sentinel. The cabin, once abandoned and empty, was alive now, filled with quiet strength, unspoken longing, and the thrill of danger just beyond the threshold. Takeda understood that his journey was far from over. The end he had sought was gone, replaced by questions he had no answers to, mysteries he could not yet solve, and a life that demanded courage he had almost forgotten he possessed. In the dim light, Liwea moved closer, her hand brushing his arm, tentative but steady. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, leaving only the promise of connection, of understanding, of love, that had the power to bloom even in the harshest soil. Tokuda felt a warmth he had thought impossible, and yet even as he reached for it, the shadow at the tree line remained. A reminder that the world beyond the meadow was watching, waiting, and ready to test the fragile beginnings of the life he had found. And as the night deepened, the rain softened to a whisper, and the firelight flickered against the walls, Takeda and Liwea sat in silence, knowing that their story had only just begun, that the abandoned cabin held secrets yet to be uncovered, and that the pulse of life and love was far stronger than either of them had imagined. The wind carried hints of danger, whispers of past lives, and the thrill of the unknown, and Takeda realized that whatever lay ahead, he was no longer seeking an end. He was ready to face whatever the land and the heart had in store. The days that followed carried a restless energy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Tokuda could feel it in the way the wind shifted without warning, in the strange quiet that settled over the meadow before sunrise, and in the way Liwea moved, always aware, always alert. The storm had passed, leaving the earth wet and the air thick with the smell of pine and moss. but it had also awakened something older in the woods. Shadows seemed longer, and every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, echoed with meaning. Tokuda knew that the presence he had sensed before had not vanished. Whoever or whatever had watched them from the tree line remained close, waiting, and that knowledge tightened his chest with tension he could neither ignore nor dismiss. Liwia, for her part, seemed equally unsettled. She moved with purpose, gathering herbs and tending her small garden, yet her eyes often darted toward the forest, her hands brushing against the petals of wild flowers, as if drawing courage from them. She never spoke of her past. Though Tokuda had begun to notice faint signs of a life marked by both skill and hardship, her hands calloused from labor, her eyes sharp enough to catch the flight of birds before they took off, her posture alert yet graceful. It was clear she had known struggle, yet there was resilience there that drew Tokuda to her, a quiet power that mirrored his own. The connection between them was growing, but the shadow at the edges of their lives made every step toward each other feel fragile, as if the world could pull them apart at any moment. One afternoon, Tokuda rode toward the far side of the creek, where the forest thickened and the sunlight barely reached the ground. He needed to check on the small fence he had built to protect the garden from deer, but what he found instead unsettled him further. Footprints human and deliberate marred the soft earth. They were fresh, large, and careful, as if someone had moved through the woods knowing exactly where to step. Tokuda knelt to study them, tracing the path with his fingers, and felt a surge of unease. Someone had been close to the cabin, close enough to see them, to watch them, and yet they had not revealed themselves. The thought that the forest was no longer theirs alone tightened his jaw and quickened his pulse. Back at the cabin, Liwia noticed the change in his demeanor. Her eyes were sharp, questioning, as she reached for the small knife she carried at her side. Tokuda said nothing at first, letting the silence speak, but finally he showed her the prints. Her lips pressed together, and she nodded, understanding without words. "They are looking for something," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of warning, or someone. Tokuda felt the weight of her words settle in the room, heavier than the logs stacked by the hearth, heavier than the air itself. They had not yet spoken of their fears, but both knew the truth. The safety they had found in the cabin was fragile, and the past they had tried to leave behind was creeping closer. That night, Tokuda could not sleep. He wandered to the porch, Kiona following silently, and stared into the darkened forest. Every rustle, every distant howl, seemed magnified in the still night. He remembered Calvert's journal, the stories of shadows and whispers, and wondered if the history of the cabin was repeating itself, if the land itself was warning them. The fire inside the hearth cast flickering shadows across the walls, and for a moment Tokuda felt as though the cabin itself was alive, holding its breath, waiting. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke, not from their fire but from somewhere deeper in the woods. A signal, perhaps, or a warning. The next morning brought an uneasy quiet. Tokuda and Liwia worked side by side, repairing a section of the roof damaged by the previous storm, but conversation was sparse. Each seemed lost in thought, aware of the presence that lingered beyond the trees. When Tokuda moved to the creek to fetch water, he noticed fresh markings on the rocks, symbols carved in a way that suggested intent, a message left behind. He traced them carefully with his fingers, trying to discern their meaning, but they were cryptic, threatening in their precision. Liwia came beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of her knife. "They are not just watching," she said, her voice low. "They are waiting." The tension in the air began to seep into every aspect of their lives. Liwi's garden became a sanctuary, but also a point of vulnerability. Every movement toward it felt like an act of defiance, a risk taken in the face of an unseen threat. Tokuda reinforced the cabin, repaired the fences, and stocked the larder. Each action an attempt to regain control over a situation that was slowly slipping beyond their grasp. And yet, in the midst of fear, there was a growing bond between them, quiet intimacy that needed no words. They shared meals by the fire, tended the land together, and sometimes, late at night, their hands would brush, and a warmth would pass between them, fragile but undeniable. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Tokuda heard a voice carried on the wind, a soft, melodic call he recognized instantly as Liwia's. He rode toward it, heart racing, and found her kneeling by a cluster of wildflowers. her hands moving over the petals with a tender care that belied the danger they faced. "The land is alive," she said softly, without looking up. "It knows we are here. It knows we are being watched." Takoda knelt beside her, feeling the pulse of life in the soil, in the flowers, in the quiet hum of the forest around them. The words Calvert had written in the journal returned to him. The land remembers, the land protects, and sometimes the land punishes. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden rustle in the underbrush. Takoda's hand moved instinctively to his bow, and Liwia drew her knife with a speed that spoke of years of training. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and thin, cloaked in the muted colors of the forest. His eyes glinted in the fading light, sharp and calculating. He did not speak, but his presence alone was enough to make Takoda and Liwia tense. The figure circled them slowly, observing, then retreated into the trees without a word. Takoda felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. They were not alone, and the path they had tried to escape was closing in from all sides. That night, as rain began to fall lightly against the cabin, Takoda and Liwia sat by the fire, silent but aware of the unspoken tension between them. Each could feel the weight of the unknown pressing against their walls, against the fragile bubble of safety they had carved out. Takoda thought of the journal, of the stories it contained, and wondered if their lives were becoming a reflection of what had come before. Yet, in that darkness, there was also a spark of connection, a shared strength that neither had expected to find. The storm deepened by morning. Thunder rolling across the mountains and lightning illuminating the forest in brief, blinding flashes. Takoda and Liwia moved carefully, checking the cabin, securing supplies, and tending to Kiona. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. The wind carried whispers, and though they could not make out the words, the tone was unmistakable. Warning, threat, promise of confrontation. Takoda's heart tightened, knowing that the unknown force moving through the forest was patient, methodical, and waiting for the moment when they might falter. In the quiet moments between the storm, their bond deepened, yet the threat remained, persistent and unresolved. Liwia spoke of her life before the meadow of the hardships she had endured, though never fully revealing the people or dangers she had left behind. Takoda shared pieces of his past, of battles fought and losses endured, each story a thread weaving them closer, even as the shadows at the edge of the forest grew longer. There was fear, yes, but also an undeniable pull, a promise that even in the midst of uncertainty, life could bloom in unexpected ways. By nightfall, the forest seemed to settle, the storm moving eastward, leaving a damp, fertile quiet in its wake. Yet the sense of being watched did not leave. Takoda and Liwia sat by the hearth, their hands brushing occasionally. Hearts aligned in a fragile rhythm, aware that the world beyond the meadow was closing in, that the shadow at the tree line had not yet revealed its intentions, and that their journey was only beginning. The cabin, once a place of abandonment and despair, had become a crucible of connection, mystery, and danger, a place where life and love could grow, but only if they were willing to face what lay ahead. The dawn arrived heavy with mist, the meadow shrouded in gray as if the world itself was holding its breath. Takoda stood on the porch of the cabin, Kiona shifting beneath him, sensing the tension in the air. The forest beyond was quiet, almost too quiet, and every snap of a twig sounded like a warning. He could feel the pulse of the land beneath his boots, the same pulse that had first drawn him here, now racing with the rhythm of danger. Liwia appeared at the edge of the clearing, carrying water from the creek, her copper hair damp from dew, her eyes sharp and alert. For a moment their gazes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a mixture of worry, determination, and a fragile thread of trust that had grown over the weeks. They moved through their morning routines cautiously, aware that the forest was no longer just a home but a stage for the unknown. Takoda checked the perimeter, reinforcing the fences around Liwia's garden, while she tended to the hearth and prepared breakfast. Every sound from the tree line, the flutter of a bird, the rustle of leaves, made them pause, hearts quickening. Takoda's hand never strayed far from his bow, Liwia's knife always at her side. Even the animals seemed aware, moving closer to the cabin, as if seeking the safety it offered. Yet despite the fear, the bond between them had strengthened. Each shared glance, each touch of hands while stacking firewood, carried a quiet promise of connection, of courage drawn from one another. By midday, the wind shifted, carrying a scent unfamiliar and bitter. Sharp against the fresh smell of pine and rain-soaked earth, Takoda's instincts flared. He dismounted and crept toward the edge of the forest, Liwea close behind him. In the distance, he spotted the figure that had haunted the tree line for days, cloaked in shadows, eyes glinting with intent.
Oh.
This time, the figure moved closer, deliberate and measured. Takoda's heart tightened. The stranger wasn't just a watcher anymore. He had stepped into their world, and every step he took seemed to reverberate through the earth. Liwea's hand brushed Takoda's arm, grounding him, reminding him that they were not alone in this. "They want something," she said quietly, voice tense but calm. "Or someone. And they will not leave until they have it." Takoda nodded, scanning the forest. The journal from Calvert's cabin sprang to mind, with its warnings of those who lurked in the woods and the consequences for those who disturbed the balance of the land. He realized that whatever awaited them was tied to the past of this cabin, to the secrets Liyue had yet to reveal, and perhaps even to his own history that he could not fully escape. As the day wore on, strange signs began to appear. Symbols carved into tree trunks, rocks shifted in ways that seemed deliberate, and the faint sound of whispers drifted on the wind. Takoda and Liyue moved cautiously, tracing the symbols, trying to understand what message was being left for them. The tension was electric. Every movement felt charged with meaning. Every shadow seemed alive. Liyue revealed little, only murmuring that the forest had a memory and that some forces could not be ignored. Her presence was steady, her courage unwavering, yet Takoda sensed the quiet fear beneath her calm exterior. It was a fear mirrored in his own heart, a fear of what they did not yet know, but would soon confront. Evening brought no relief. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the meadow, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Takoda and Liyue secured the cabin as best they could, boarding up windows, stacking firewood near the walls, and preparing the hearth. Kiwana nickered softly, sensing the unease that hung over the place. They shared a meal in silence, each bite heavy with anticipation. Then, as night fell, the first signs of movement appeared beyond the tree line. Figures emerged, not one but several, moving in the shadows with careful precision. Takoda felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The unknown was no longer approaching. They were here. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt fragile. Dakota's grip tightened on his bow, Liyue's knife gleaming faintly in the firelight. They exchanged a glance that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the danger and the trust they had built between them. Every rustle in the forest set their nerves on edge. The wind carried whispers that seemed almost human, words they could not understand. Yet the tone was unmistakable: threat, warning, intention. Takoda realized that the climax of their struggle was near. Every choice they had made, every step into the woods, had led them to this night, and the cabin would be their battleground. The figures moved closer, emerging fully into the moonlight. Takoda could see now that they were armed, their faces shadowed, but expressions unmistakably determined. Liyue's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer to Takoda, her hand finding his. The warmth of her touch anchored him, even as fear threatened to overwhelm. He whispered her name, and she responded with a quiet nod, understanding that they faced the moment together. Every instinct screamed at him to defend, to fight, to survive. And yet beneath the fear there was another feeling, hope, fragile and bright, that they could endure whatever was coming. Thunder rolled across the mountains, a deep growl that mirrored the tension coiling in Takoda's chest. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in jagged bursts, revealing glimpses of movement in the shadows. The figures paused, watching, waiting, and Takoda felt the pulse of the cabin, the pulse of the land beneath his boots, urging him to stand firm. Liyue's grip tightened around his arm, and he could feel the strength in her stance, the quiet resolve that had drawn him to her from the very first moment. The unknown force had made its presence known, and now there was no turning back. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The wind howled through the trees, rain began to fall again, drumming on the roof and soaking the earth. Every creak of timber, every splash of water from the creek heightened the suspense. Though Takoda and Liyue moved silently through the cabin, checking windows, doors, and traps they had set. Each corner they turned, each shadow they passed, felt pregnant with danger. the past of the cabin, the history of the land, and the unknown intentions of the figures in the forest all pressed upon them at once. Yet, even in the face of imminent peril, their connection remained, a tether of trust, of unspoken understanding, and of the beginnings of a love neither could ignore. As midnight approached, the figures at last made their move, stepping fully into the clearing with intent clear in every motion. Takeda and Liwia stood side by side, hearts racing, breath steady, ready to confront the unknown. The forest seemed to lean closer, holding its breath with them, the storm above adding urgency to every movement. Kiona pawed the ground, sensing the tension, while the fire in the hearth cast shadows that danced like restless spirits. Dakota felt the culmination of every challenge, every fear, every mystery that had brought them to this moment. The climax was near, the night thick with suspense, and the resolution still just out of reach. And yet, even in the midst of fear, even as the shadows closed in and the storm raged around them, there was a spark of light, fragile, unspoken, and undeniable. Takeda could feel it in Liwei's presence, in the land itself, and in the heartbeat of the cabin that had become their home. The world beyond the meadow was dangerous, unpredictable, and full of secrets. But here, in the storm, in the shadow, they had each other. The tension reached its peak, every sound amplified, every heartbeat counted, and the story teetered on the edge of the unknown, ready to explode into a moment that would test them in every way. The night held them in its grasp, and as lightning illuminated the clearing once more, Tokoda and Liwia stood together, side by side, hearts aligned, ready for whatever was coming, aware that the resolution was still ahead, and that the cabin, the land, and their bond would be tested like never before. The storm, the forest, and the unknown force pressing against them created a tension so intense it was almost tangible. And the audience could feel the anticipation building, waiting for the moment when courage, love, and fate would collide in the most critical turning point of their journey. The storm had passed, leaving the forest glistening under the pale light of dawn. Rain clung to the leaves, turning the world into a shimmering mosaic of green and silver, and the creek babbled gently, as if nothing had ever disturbed its course. Takoda stood on the porch of the cabin, Kiona resting beside him, ears alert yet relaxed. The tension that had coiled in his chest for days began to loosen, replaced by a quiet clarity. Liwia emerged from the garden, water dripping from her copper hair, eyes bright with determination and relief. The shadows that had haunted them felt further away now, replaced by the simple truth that they had endured together and had emerged stronger. The figures from the tree line were gone, retreating as silently as they had appeared, leaving only subtle signs that they had been near the crushed grass, faint footprints in the mud, and the symbols etched into the bark of the trees. Tokuda traced them carefully, feeling the land's memories settle around him. Each mark seemed to whisper a lesson. The past could threaten, but it could also teach. Liwia joined him, her hand finding his fingers intertwining naturally. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was no fear in the glance, only trust, recognition, and a quiet joy that life could survive even in the harshest places. Over the next days, they began to rebuild not just the cabin, but the sense of home it offered. Tokoda repaired the boards that had once threatened to collapse, while Liwi arranged the interior with care, bringing warmth and life into every corner. Together they planted new wildflowers near the creek, placing the ones that had been trampled, and tended a small vegetable garden that promised sustenance and a shared purpose. Each action, simple yet deliberate, stitched their lives closer together. They laughed, shared stories of the past, and began to dream quietly about a future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and rose across the horizon, Tokuda and Liwia sat together on the porch. The fire from the hearth flickered through the windows, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of the cabin. Liwia leaned her head against Tokoda's shoulder, and he rested his hand gently on her back. There was a silence between them, full and comfortable, a peace neither had known in years. The tension of the forest, the storm, and the unknown watchers had faded, leaving behind only the land, the cabin, and each other. Tokoda realized that the life he had come to end had instead begun anew, shaped not by fear or loss, but by connection, courage, and love. The journal of Calvert, which had haunted the cabin with warnings, now felt more like a guide than a prophecy. Tokoda read the passages aloud to Liwei by the fire, tracing the history of the land, the lessons learned by those who had come before. She listened intently, her eyes reflecting the flickering light, and together they found understanding in the old words. The cabin, abandoned and forgotten, had become a vessel for renewal, teaching them that even in isolation, life could thrive, and even in danger, hope could endure. Days turned into weeks, and the couple's presence brought life back to the meadow. Birds nested in the trees, rabbits darted across the tall grass, and the forest seemed to pulse with approval. Neighbors from distant homesteads began to notice smoke rising from the chimney, a sign that life had returned to the abandoned cabin. Though Tokoda and Liwei were cautious with strangers, they welcomed the occasional traveler, sharing water, food, and the story of the cabin's revival. Word spread that the place once left to ruin now held safety, shelter, and a sense of peace, drawing in those who needed it most. One crisp morning, as the first frost touched the meadow, Tokoda and Liwei discovered a small bundle at the edge of the forest to fawn, shivering and alone. They took it in, wrapping it gently in a cloth and feeding it from a handmade bottle. The act of care deepened their bond even further, a reflection of the life they had nurtured in each other. Tokoda's hand brushed Liwei's as they worked together, and this time the touch carried no fear, only a quiet certainty that their lives were intertwined in ways they could never undo. The days continued, filled with labor, laughter, and quiet evenings by the fire. The mystery of the figures in the forest faded into memory, leaving only the knowledge that life, however unpredictable, could be met with courage and resilience. Liwei finally shared pieces of her past journey to this place, the challenges she had faced, and the strength she had cultivated to survive. Tokoda shared his own burdens, stories of battles fought, friends lost and love abandoned. With each revelation, the cabin transformed further, not just a home, but a sanctuary where two souls, weathered by the world, could heal together. One evening, under a sky ablaze with stars, Tokoda and Liwei walked along the creek, the water reflecting the silver light above. Kiona followed silently, ears twitching at every sound. Liwei paused, brushing her hand across the water, and looked at Tokoda with eyes that held both mischief and tenderness. "We survived the forest," she said softly, "and the storm. And whatever it was that haunted this place." Tokoda nodded, his hand finding hers, holding it firmly, as if anchoring himself to the moment. "Yes," he said, "but more than that, we found something worth living for." Their shared silence was full of meaning. The abandoned cabin, the storm, the forest, and the unknown threat had tested them in every way. Yet from the darkness and danger, they had built a life, not just of survival, but of connection, hope, and love. Tokoda realized that the end he had sought was never truly about dying. It had been about discovering what made life worth living. Liwei had been the answer all along, a reminder that even in the most isolated places, love could grow, and that courage and trust could forge bonds stronger than fear. In the days that followed, the couple planted a small orchard near the cabin, each tree a testament to endurance and new beginnings. They laughed as they worked, sharing meals on the porch and stories under the stars. Kiona ran through the meadow freely, the fawn now playful and healthy, and the forest itself seemed at peace, no longer holding shadows at its edge. Tokoda and Liwei often paused to take it all in the mountains, rising proudly. The creek winding like a silver thread, the cabin standing strong as a symbol of what they had overcome. The story of the abandoned cabin, once a place of despair, now carried a new chapter, one of love, resilience, and hope. Tokoda and Liwei had faced the unknown together, endured threats that tested their courage, emerged not only alive but transformed. They had discovered that the world, even in its wildest and most dangerous moments, could offer purpose, connection, and happiness. The land had healed them as much as they had nurtured it, and the cabin had become more than shelter. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a testament to life reclaimed. As the sun set one final time, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and rose, Tokoda and Liwei stood on the porch, hands entwined, hearts aligned. The wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, and the forest around them seemed to hum with life. Kiona rested at their feet, the fawn nestled nearby, and the cabin glowed with warmth from the hearth. For the first time in years, Dakota allowed himself to feel fully alive, not as a man haunted by loss, but as one who had found purpose, love, and a future worth living. Liwia leaned into him, her presence a promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And in that moment, the abandoned cabin was no longer a symbol of despair, but of new beginnings. Life had returned, love had blossomed, and the mysteries of the past had faded into lessons rather than threats. Tokota realized that the land, the cabin, and Liwia had given him something he had long thought impossible, a reason to live fully, to love openly, and to embrace the future with courage. The forest was still wild, the creek still flowed, and the mountains still stood as silent witnesses. But now, Tokota and Liwei were ready not just to survive, but to thrive, together, in the life they had earned. The cabin stood quietly under the evening sky, smoke curling gently from the chimney, birds settling into the trees, and stars beginning to shine. In the heart of the wilderness, two lives intertwined, healed, and found joy, proving that even the most abandoned places could hold love, and even the most broken hearts could find hope. And as the night embraced the meadow, Dakota and Liwei stepped inside the cabin, closing the door softly behind them, ready to begin the life they had discovered together. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice.